Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I want to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in this talk, I am going to insert a little bit of a change up in our history talks, and I want to give you the story of Queen Esther. Much of the information for this talk is found in a book called The Monuments and the Old Testament, and it's by Ira Price. Now, as a little girl, as probably many other little girls, I loved the story of Queen Esther. It was my favorite Bible story. And truly, it is an amazing story of God's deliverance for his people. So let's go back to the time before the story of Queen Esther took place. This will give us a little background for the story of Queen Esther. Already in the time of King Solomon, the nation of Israel had begun to weaken. The people had turned away from God, and he had permitted them to be taken into captivity. Babylon, that head of gold in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, was the first to overthrow and to destroy the Judean kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar had a long reign. He actually reigned for 43 years. And he was good to the Babylonian exiles. They enjoyed many citizen privileges, and they had settled homes and fixed communities. He even made a Jew, Daniel, the prime minister of his kingdom. It's interesting to note that Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned more than 150 times in the Old Testament. That's a lot of times, isn't it? Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he was a great builder. He equaled and maybe even surpassed Ramses II of Egypt. But pride overtook him, and he said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built?" Now, after Nebuchadnezzar, the throne actually changed hands 3 times before a man by the name of Nabonidus took the throne. Now, Nabonidus, he was Belshazzar's father. And when Daniel came before Belshazzar there, that fateful night when Babylon fell, he was promised to be the 3rd ruler of Babylon. Now, this was because Nabonidus, the father, was first, and his eldest son, Belshazzar, he was second, and then Daniel would have been the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. When Cyrus took Babylon, he appointed Darius the Mede to rule there. Now, Darius the Mede was the king who appointed Daniel also to be president. Darius had been tricked into throwing Daniel into the lion's den, but Darius actually really loved Daniel, and he was good to the Jews. He permitted about 50,000 Jews to return to their homeland and to lay the foundation of the temple. Now, Darius the Mede should not be confused with Darius the First, who came after. Now, Darius the First has been actually called the greatest king of the Medes and the Persians. He built Shushan, the beautiful palace in the city of Susa. He also permitted the work on the temple to continue. It was under his reign that the temple was completed. The son of Darius I was Xerxes, which is the Greek term for his name, or Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew. And he was the husband of Queen Esther. He inherited from his father the beautiful palace, Shushan, and he also inherited a great kingdom. In Esther chapter 1, verse 1, we find that Ahasuerus reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, and over 127 provinces. In verse 3, we find that the king makes a feast for all of his princes and servants and nobles at his palace. And the feast, it happened in the 3rd year of the reign of Ahasuerus. Now in verse 4, it says that it lasted 180 days. History tells us that these feasts had as many as 15,000 people and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The palace had 3 groups of distinctive apartments, each surrounded by a special enclosure, and yet they were all comprised there of the same fortress. Now the city, Susa, and the palace, Shushan, it's an archaeology delight. It's been said that there is perhaps no city where the scenes of the Old Testament narrative can so accurately be reconstructed. The palace is huge. Now, I don't know if we know where the feast exactly took place, but if it was in the throne hall, the building is gigantic. The hall itself covers more than 20 acres. It had 36 fluted columns that were 67 feet high. And it was supported by a flat cedar wood roof that was bought from Phoenicia. Now, the columns were arranged in a square. The back had a solid wall with 4 doorways. The building actually, it kind of resembled a Greek temple. So everything in the palace is larger, on a scale of 18 times larger. The porticos, the stairways, enclosures. There's one gigantic stairway that leads from the parade ground to the hanging garden. And the garden was where the king went after Esther told him that Haman wished to destroy her and her people, remember. Ahasuerus was a warrior king. When he had called this 180-day feast, he had put down a rebellion there in Egypt, and he had subjugated them. Now, the next country that he wished to conquer was Greece. At the time of this feast, he had already gone to war with Greece, but Greece was not so easy to conquer. And of course, we know that it was actually Greece which eventually conquered Medo-Persia. History tells us the purpose of Ahasuerus' feast was to impress the princes and the nobles of his realm with his riches and his power, and also to feel out and see if he had support from them in another campaign against Greece. Now, the feast was really a series of banquets, and at its close, it was decided that they would go to war against Greece. Now, we're told in verse 5 that when these days were expired, that's the 180-day feast, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto the great and the small, and it was 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So after this 180-day feast, and this feast had been open to all of the people there of his realm, after that he had this 7-day feast, which was just for those that were in his palace. Now, most likely the feast moved from a larger place to what we are told was the king's garden. And the Bible describes the beauty of this garden. Esther, chapter 1, verse 6 says, "There were white, green, and blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple, to silver rings, and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble." Now, verse 7 says, "And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king." Now, wine, it became the villain in this story. In verse 10, it says that the king's heart was merry with wine. In fact, he was so drunk that he could not think properly. Probably at the suggestion of some of the evil men of his palace, the king ordered that Vashti, the queen, come before these drunk men to show them her beauty. The author, E.G. White, says, "When this command came from the king, Vashti did not carry out his orders, because she knew that wine had been freely used, and that Ahasuerus was under the influence of the intoxicating liquor. Now, for her husband's sake, as well as her own, she decided not to leave her position as the head of the women of the court. It was when the king was not himself, when his reason was dethroned by wine drinking that he sent for the queen. That those present at the feast, men besought by wine, might gaze on her beauty. And here is a powerful statement. It says of Vashti, she acted in harmony with a pure conscience. And that Vashti refused to obey the king's command, thinking that when he came to himself, he would commend her course of action. But the king had unwise advisers. They urged it would be a power given to a woman that would be to her injury. So quite the audacity, isn't it? These men, they pretended to act as though they had a special interest in protecting women. Historians tell us that Macedonian ladies introduced to such banquets in Darius's day, they were basely insulted. Besides, Vashti was put in charge of the other ladies of the palace for this feast. In verse 9, it says, the feast was in the royal house. The king had two main palaces. There was Shushan, which was in Susa. And then there was Persepolis, which was about 200 miles southeast of Susa. Now, there are actually many walls with their stairways that may be still seen of this palace, with elaborately carved figures of leaves and people bringing tribute to the king. So Shushan was called the Summer Palace, and this Persepolis was the Winter Palace. Now, Esther would have lived in both palaces. Susa was the principal capital for King Ahasuerus, but he did not only carry out his activities there. He carried out activities in both of the palaces, both places. Now, what Persepolis has been called, though, was a harem. So it's likely that Vashti was entertaining the women at this palace, or as the Bible says, the royal house. If she had left the charge of these women to go and to be the sport of a bunch of drunk men, what would have happened to the women who were left in her charge? As Mrs. White says, Ellen G. White, and I believe what she says, she acted in harmony with a pure conscience. However, the king, he was in a bad place. He needed the support of the princes and the nobles, the military, and the servants of his court. He was going to war with Greece. He had just been victorious in gaining the support of the important men of his large realm. How could he now go against the counsel of the important men within his own palace? Now, when we look at the story of Esther, Vashti is really the first hero. She acted in harmony with a pure conscience, and she was persecuted for it. Of course, we know the story. Vashti, she was banished, and Esther became the new queen. It's been said that if we do not gain victory over our weak areas, the same test is going to keep coming to us. And this seems to be exactly what happened to King Ahasuerus. With Vashti, he failed. But little did he know that he would be facing a similar test, again with his new and beautiful Queen Esther. At Shushan, there was an interior court grouping around themselves. This court were the special apartments of the king. There was the audience hall, the rest chamber, rooms for armory, and for the guards and the king's subsidiaries. Now, the private dwelling of the king, it was designed for isolation, and it had a turret which also protected it. It was on the southeast angle there of the Acropolis. Now, the sleeping chamber, it had all of the comforts that should induce a good night's sleep. And yet one night the king just could not sleep. And if we can read about this in Esther chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "The king commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king." So this was the first introduction of the king to the man Mordecai. Now, Mordecai was a man who, like Vashti, acted in harmony with a pure conscience. He refused to bow down to Haman, and like Vashti, he was being persecuted for it. Haman actually planned to hang Mordecai on the gallows. However, the king did not know of this plot against Mordecai, who had actually done a great service for the king. He had exposed there was a plot against the king for his life, and he had exposed this. And Mordecai was also the queen's cousin. So anyhow, the king, though, he did not know about Haman devising this plot against Mordecai. He didn't also know that there was this plot that was going to actually take his own queen's life. The first time that the king was tested, he banished Queen Vashti. This time, his queen was to be murdered. Now, through Esther, the Lord did accomplish a mighty deliverance for his people. Again, E.G. White says, "Little did the king realize the far-reaching results that would have accompanied the complete carrying out of this decree. Satan himself, the hidden instigator of the scheme, was trying to rid the earth of those who preserved the knowledge of the true God." And also, Satan, he wished to destroy God's people because he knew that Christ would come through this line. He had already tried to destroy the hope of a redeemer in the time of Moses, remember, by killing all the baby boys. And now he was trying to kill all the Jews in the vast realm of King Ahasuerus. Now, continuing on, Ellen White, she says, "The trying experiences that came to God's people in the days of Esther were not peculiar to that age alone. The same spirit that in ages past led men to persecute the true church will in the future lead to the pursuance of a similar course towards those who maintain their loyalty to God. The decree that will finally go forth against the remnant people of God will be very similar to that issued by Ahasuerus against the Jews. Today, the enemies of the true church, they see in the little company keeping the Sabbath commandment a Mordecai at the gate. The reverence of God's people for his law is a constant rebuke to those who have cast off the fear of the Lord and are trampling on his Sabbath." So we know from prophecy that there will not be a king like Ahasuerus who will counter the decree against God's people in the end time. Again, E.G. White says that to secure popularity and patronage, legislators will yield to the demand for Sunday laws. Yet, as the Lord vindicated his truth and his people there in the days of Queen Esther, he again promises to do that for his own. If you have enjoyed this talk, I would just like to encourage you to click on that like and subscribe button and leave your comments. And I just want to thank you for listening, and God bless.